Thank you very much for a very kind introduction. I'm impressed by how well this organized this conference is, but also how well the topics fit together so far. And as you said in your introduction, what I will be doing is I will take the perspective of the live course that has been present in both of the previous presentations, and we'll look at what happens in terms of gender inequality on labor market. So I will be looking at working age populations. I'm not at all an expert on pensions or pension systems, although I so far have learned already quite a lot. Let me see, does this work? Yes. And the work that I will be presenting is based on joint work with several colleagues, and the papers are cited on the slides, probably too small to read, but you can download the slides, I think, after the conference, and then there's a reference list in case you're interested. And in case you're interested in more of the technicalities behind some of these analyses, of course, I'm always willing and very happy to explain what we've been up to. So what I will be talking about is the intersection between economic inequality between rich and poor households and gender. And then on top of that, what family policy has to do with that. And to help you explain why I think it's really important to think about economic inequality, to think about gender and institutional context all at the same time, even though it's of course rather complex, is to introduce you to two types of inequality that are often distinguished between. It's horizontal and vertical inequality. When I talk, and I've used very stylized icons, and people and families, of course, look much more diverse right now, nowadays, and have always done. I'm very well aware of that, but I hope they will help to bring the points across. So when we talk about inequality among genders or between genders, and inequality between rich and poor households, very often we enter very different literatures. And of course, my argument is that we should try to bring those together, and I will make a very, very first step in doing so here. Because when we're talking about the differences among genders, the differences between men and women in terms of earnings or employment or occupations or pensions, very often we have a set of theories that relate to the value of unpaid work, so care work. It's about bargaining perspectives, who can bargain within a couple, who can bargain out of doing those unpaid works, who can bargain themselves into the labor market. It's about doing gender, so it's about norms. It's about reproducing norms by how we act. And of course, it's about what the opportunities are that are provided by work-family reconciliation policies, such as paid leave and childcare institutions. And we'll get back to those. When we talk about vertical inequality, so households that have high earnings versus households that have low earnings, which is very, very popular nowadays, for good reasons, has been among academics, and now it's in the general public as well. And those theories, and of course I'm simplifying a little bit here, but they talk about, well, inequality is rising because of austerity. Welfare states are retrenching, becoming less generous in many European countries, which causes the disposable household incomes to become more unequal. We talk about the robots are coming, as in robots, or rather algorithms, will take over jobs, and mostly those of the lowest skilled. So they are more likely to lose their job, and they already had a difficult time, the lowest skilled, because nowadays they're competing with low-wage workers in low-wage countries, which is of course an indication of globalization. Capital, income from capital is accumulating among the top, of course, among the very top, which is a further driver of inequality. And what strikes me is that books who are otherwise excellent, that deal with these kinds of analysis, they tend to neglect gender. There is no woman in a book on capital, and I won't give any names, but it is on the 21st century. And that is striking. And of course, there are plenty of good examples as well. But these literatures are, by and large, separated. So what I will do is make an argument saying it's really interesting to include some of the knowledge we have of what childcare and paid leave, because that's what I will focus on, can do for gender inequality, and what gender inequality as such can do for the levels of inequality between rich households and poor households. So these literatures are related, and it is valuable to do so. So I will give you 3 stylized arguments why it is interesting to have a look at that. Because these family policies that have been around for a while, and the rise of women's employment, labor market participation over the last decades in mostly European countries is what we'll be talking about. Of course, may have created, on the one hand, a division between single earner households and dual earner households. And dual earner households, of course, will be more likely to have, well, basically a double income. And of course, even 3 or 4 decades ago, there were dual earner households. It's not a very recent invention. Of course it's not. So it may very well be that the rise of women's employment and the rise, of course, of women's earnings, more similar, but at a disadvantage, but more similar to men's earnings, may have decreased the unbalance between single earners and dual earners, simply because there's proportionally more dual earner households nowadays. But of course, it may be also the case that, particularly in the lower end of the income distribution, increasingly single earner households are struggling more because they're competing with all those dual earner couples. A second argument why it is important to connect perspectives on gender with vertical economic inequality here is the idea that people don't end up in marriages or in couples randomly. People choose each other, and increasingly choose each other based on their education, where they meet, and future earnings prospects. And we've seen in the last recent decades that more highly educated men are more likely to be more together with more highly educated women. And again, of course, the universe of couples is much more diverse. But there is this there is a trend toward what is called homogamy. And the same goes for income. So what you get then is it's more likely that you get 2 high-earning, professional, career-striving partners that are competing with another dual-earner couple, but they work both in manufacturing, for instance. So you get 2 very high wages compared to lower wages, which may, of course, affect the level of inequality between rich and poor households. And then finally, this is my third argument, but I'm sure there are more, but there's an increase in family diversity. And it has been mentioned, I think, in both presentations before. So what I focus here on today is the rise of single parenthood. It's not exactly new, it's been there forever, but it does seem to become more and more common. So then even if there would be full gender equality, I mean, if you look, the euro sign among the women and the men are equal in this little diagram. Even then, you still end up with a single earner who, in practice, of course, has much more difficulties combining the work and family responsibilities, but more on that later, to a dual earner couple with similar wages, so it's still twice the wage. So these are 3 processes that are very important to integrate into our analysis of economic inequality on the one hand, but also when we talk about family policy outcomes. So after this first conceptual argument, I will show you a little bit of data, and then I will show you I will summarize some of the literature on family policy outcomes with, and my own research included, of course, with a focus on these aspects. So this is very simple diagram. I will walk you through it. It's on how likely women, so these are households where women are present, and I ranked them for 2 countries. We're going to look at the Netherlands first. And I just picked those 2 countries, one because I'm here, and the other one because it makes the argument very clear. In reality, we did this for 18 countries. So I ranked these households from the lowest decile, so the lowest income households, to the highest income households. And I looked at how likely is the woman in this household to be employed. And what you see for the Netherlands, so the red line was the situation in 1983. And what you see is that employment was pretty common for women at the top incomes, the higher range of the household distribution. And of course, it makes sense because then it's more likely to be a dual earning household, which is increasingly necessary to be at the top of the earnings distribution. And towards the lower end, you see that the participation of the employment of women is actually much lower, even below the 10%. And towards the real bottom, you see it increase a little bit again. Because, of course, women are not only employed out of career orientations, for instance, but it can be a response to the household experiencing financial strain, or in this case, poverty. The bluish line shows the situation in 2007. So what you see in the Netherlands is there has been a very marked rise in the number of employed women. A substantial part of this, of course, is part-time. But more strikingly, what you see is that the employment increase towards the real top has actually been fairly small, and it has been relatively large in the middle and the lower end of the income distribution of households. So here there is potential, so these deciles don't show you the levels, of course, but at least there is potential that the lower half of the households saw an increase in women's employment, which doesn't prove but indicates the potential for this trend to reduce the overall levels of inequality among households. Now, here we look at Finland. We saw in the red line, 1987, we saw already a much higher rate of employment among women, which is, of course, well documented and well known. And a little bit lower at the lower ends of the income distribution. And we also see the bluish line is 2010, a slight decrease in employment. And the average decrease in employment rate is not that large. It's actually fairly small, but it is pronounced at the lower end of the income distribution. So it's the lower income women, probably the more likely, lower educated women, who are no longer employed, opted out, pushed out. Different explanations can play a role here, but of course that has a potential to increase inequality. So to do it a little bit more systematically, and this analysis is based on, this is actually based on slightly more complex analysis, but this figure gives you a good summary of the main findings. What we did is we looked at households, just at couples, and we looked at what share of the income is contributed by women, and what share of the household income is contributed by men. So if employment rate of women go up, if their earnings go up, if they start working more hours, if they get better occupations, better paying occupations, then if the situation for men is equal, their share, what they contribute to the household income, will go up. And it has gone up. It has gone up in all European and OECD countries. And we did that at different time points. So this covers several decades and 18 countries. And here we see how much the share of women's earnings in the total household income increased in terms of percentage points. And then here on the vertical axis, you see what the impact has been on household inequality. And the simple message here is that in those countries where the share of women's earnings in the households increased more, on average, the inequality among households was reduced in relation to those earnings. Of course, other factors can still drive up inequality, but that's taken out here. And you see in the left top corner, Finland, actually that it did reduce inequality a little bit, and that's because it's not just about the employment, the number of employed women, but also what earnings they have. So that is, it's more the improvement in the quality of employment that has reduced inequality in Finland by a couple of percentage points. So, what have we learned so far? We have learned so far that that women's earnings tend to reduce inequality among households, and the rise we've seen in women's earnings over the last decades has reduced inequality, relative inequality among households, and the last figure was just limited to coupled households. And what that means, I think, and including with the diagrams I had before, that if we focus on family policy in relation to these processes of economic inequality, it raises important new questions. And those important new questions relate to the single earner versus the dual earner households. Although we've seen that at least the net effect of that is reducing inequality, it's the question about who lives with whom, the higher educated, do they marry higher educated, and it relates to family diversity, including family diversity. So what can be the role of family policies here? The role of family policies, when they're formulated, they have a certain type of family in mind. It can be a traditional breadwinner model, it can be the dual earner, dual carer family policy that is in mind. And there is now an EU directive proposal on work-life balance for parents and carers, it's called, and it's currently debated. And it would be really interesting to see what aspects of that proposal will stand the scrutiny of all member states. And it suggests paid parental leave of at least 4 months for both parents and non-transferable. As far as I'm aware, there's no country that assigns more than 3 months of leave to fathers, paid leave to fathers, in the EU as of yet, so it is a rather ambitious plan. Paid paternity leave, formal care services, and these are the policies I will talk about. Flexible work arrangements, the right to ask for part-time labor, for instance, which is a double-edged sword, and carers leave, which was also mentioned for the other end, care at the other end of the life course. But it's clear that this is a dual earner, dual carer family that the EU, or the Commission, seems to have in mind here. And what we generally know from these types of policies, and we'll go into the details in the next slide, is that they promote women's employment, particularly by facilitating mothers to remain active on the labor market, but that they also tend to be inclusive, particularly when the policies are generous, inclusive to the lower end of the income distribution, so lower educated mothers or lower wage women, for instance, and that single parents, so family diversity, single parents tend to benefit from these policies as well, even though we call it dual earner, dual carer policy. Single parents really get a boost out of those policies. So when we talk about paid leave, we know that it promotes the employment of mothers, and in analysis in our paper we also show that as a result translates to reducing the inequality among coupled households as well. So we're seeing here basically a double advantage of such policies. But what we also saw in the analyses is that generously long parental leave reduces the earnings among those who are working. So the interruption of the career seems to come with a penalty in terms of wages, in career opportunities, etc. And it is a common conception that overly long periods of parental leave seems to suppress women's employment. And there are supply and demand side explanations that we can discuss later. Now, I'm sure you want me to answer the question, how long is too long? Right? The honest answer is we don't know. And the reason there are studies, and I've done a study myself, and they all seem to point, if we compare countries, to the fact that it is about 100 weeks. Beyond 100 weeks, it becomes a disincentive or exclusionary mechanism to maternal employment. But I'm still saying we don't really know, because these are studies that compare countries, and of course the nitty-gritty details of the implementation of these policies is very important here. And what these studies, including my own work, failed to include is, well, it does include the duration and the replacement rate, so how well is it paid. But it is often not taking into account who pays for it. Is it the employer has to continue paying? Is it the government agency that reimburses the employer, like it is, I think, in Finland? Or is it the a flat rate benefit paid to the mother, for instance. So these details really, really matters. And reserved months for fathers will also matter for how this leave will affect mothers. So there is not much of a full answer here. When we talk about childcare, the story is similar, but in subtle and important ways a little bit different. So childcare, again, facilitates combining work and family life for typically a much longer period of the life course, right? Childcare, paid leave is typically 1, 2, sometimes 3 years early on, and then there's childcare, which can start at the age of 1 or at the age of 6 or 7 weeks in the Netherlands until the kid goes to school. So it's a really important policy. So it does facilitate employment. It also levels early childhood development. So that's a side, well, or perhaps even primary benefit. It improves the employment of mothers. It, as a result, reduces, according to the mechanisms that I discussed, the inequality among households. But in addition, we see that among the working women in these generous childcare countries, you could say, the earnings are actually higher. So they manage not only to remain active, but also to be in better paying, longer hour occupations. There is a caveat, I'll briefly mention, it's often called the Matthew effect. We know, and that's the case in almost all countries, that it is the higher educated parents and the higher income parents who benefit most from using childcare. So it's really a challenge to make childcare available and used by parents across the income distribution. Hints on what could happen, or what could benefit this, is what's called the Childcare Triangle. Childcare needs to be available, it needs to be affordable, and it needs to be of adequate quality. And there should not be a care gap. So the period of parental leave should align with when eligibility for care centers begins. Are all family policies benefiting mothers' employment? No. When policymakers have a traditional breadwinner kind of family in mind when they design policies, when they implement policies such as very generous child benefits, cash for care schemes, which in Sweden, well, at least in English, is referred to as the home care allowance. So instead of sending your child to childcare, caring it yourself of private care and get a subsidy for that. But also joint taxation are seen and also found in the research as disincentives to women's employment, and it tends to affect the employment mostly of the lower income households. So a couple of insights on single parents, and then I'll conclude. This is based on a book that was recently published. I'm not selling it here. It's available for free online if you're interested. But of course, when we talk about single parents, we know they have a higher poverty risk. They have more difficulties combining family life with working life. And even if they are working, then they're more likely to face in-work poverty. Our labor markets are getting more unequal, more precarious. There's the gig economy. There is irregular working hours. There are non-standard working hours, and these are difficult for everyone. But if you have to care and earn all by yourself, it's extra difficult. That's the whole point. So facilitating their employment is very important for obvious reasons, including pension rights later on in life. But it is no guarantee for escaping or avoiding poverty, particularly for single earners, and single parents tend to be single earners, of course. And here, when we to understand the policies, we again need a life course perspective. It's not necessarily so that parental leave, for instance, which happens early on in the life course, at least from a child's perspective, will always help single parents, because at that point they can go on leave. But if they were on leave when they were still in a couple, and therefore maintained their employment and build up an employment history, and then a couple of years later separate or something else happens and they find themselves as a single mother, for instance, then these policies a couple of years ago helped their economic situation in the current day situation. So we found that paid leave, but it has to be paid and not too long, and public childcare does facilitate the employment of single parents, actually more so than for women in couples. So they really benefit from it. And it does help reduce their poverty to avoid lower income. So in countries with very generous dual earner policies, we see that the differences in incomes between households is small, and also between single parent and couples of coupled parents households. Child benefits, I just said that there might be a disincentive to maternal employment, which is still true. But in terms of poverty reduction for single parents, they remain a key instrument. So it's a tricky. It's not easy to give a good answer. A simple answer: are these good policies or bad policies? Because they have a variety of outcomes. And I have 1 minute to go to my conclusion slide. So the timing is excellent here. And this is just a summary of an argument that I hope is clear by now, that dual earner, dual carer family policy arrangements facilitate women's employment and facilitate women's earnings. And this is important to reduce gender inequality. And reducing gender inequality is a matter of social justice, and it is first and foremost the reason to implement such policies. Because some of the other arguments I've been giving is saying I'm using gender inequality to reach a different goal. I'm using it very instrumentally. But I see that as very positive side effects. But we should be careful, we should be aware of that, so that we not stop promoting gender inequality when we have reached, for instance, desirable levels of inequality among households. So it's first and foremost a matter of social justice. But it does help these policies and the employment that comes with it to accumulate pension rights, of course. So that's what we've been talking before the break. And it does provide a policy context that is inclusive to a diverse set of policies. And I've used single parents here as an example. And it does contribute to reducing economic inequality among rich and poor households. Thank you very much. This is something that never happens at academic conferences.
But it feels quite good, doesn't it?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rense, for an excellent presentation on the importance of family policies. We have now time for a few questions and comments. Who would like to start? Good. We have two active key speakers here. I will give.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much. Really interesting presentation, especially this graph on inequality and women's employment. I like this very much. I just want to know whether, because you were talking also about taxation and that we know that dual taxation, that this is a problem, did you look at, so to say, how this interacts with family policy? So at the end, if you have a very good family policy, but a very large disincentives in the taxation system, what counts at the end?
Should we not give the floor first to other people? Anyway.
I didn't see any other hands.
Hi, I'm Jen from the Department of Sociology at the University of Helsinki. So basically a couple of things. So I found this presentation really interesting as well. And what's really interesting for me is the feedback effect that you're trying to show between how from a gender inequality, it has a potential impact on household inequality. So I think referring to the graph that you showed where you try to reference the effect of automation on basically gender and household income inequality. So I was wondering, what about the reverse effect? Could there actually be a impact in terms of how household inequality actually affects gender inequality. And my argument is this. The argumentation is because if we understand, at least in some cases, where if you reference some of the studies like Goose and Manning and all, and they refer to the fact that automation primarily impacts, you're talking about service sector jobs, right? Or service occupations. You're talking about ISCO codes, if I'm correct, about 6 to 8 between these. These are the core ones that are primarily staffed by women, right, relative to men. So the question becomes, if these are the jobs that are more susceptible or at risk to unemployment or atypical employment due to automation, could that have an impact on gender income inequality? And in that aspect, maybe could the next step, given the fact that there are huge exogenous changes in the labor market, maybe the next question is not just an interaction of family policy, but also to understand how labor market policies could impact back into family policy again. Thanks.
Thank you. And our last question. Try to be.
Okay, so it's almost a provocation in the sense that it is, however, a genuine question, in the sense that one of the key issues is, of course, policy, care design, all that, but having more men taking it up. Now, that is the problem. You only have men taking it up if you pay them in full. And of course, that's something that, stops all economists looking at this measure. Or any economist looking at this measure, right? Now, do you have any alternative suggestion? Are there any other incentives that you could give men? You're a young man, you're talking about care. That's quite unusual, and I love it. Do you have any suggestion? I know about paying men in full, right?
Thank you. It's your turn, Rense.
These are interesting and excellent questions. Thank you very much. And I certainly don't have full answers yet. Perhaps in a couple of years from now. Katja, I have not, in this study, I have not looked at the difference between joint and dual taxation for the very simple reason I've been following countries over time using fixed effects. So basically, what I was doing, comparing countries to themselves before and after. In this case, family policy change. And the dual and joint taxation systems have been remarkable. There have been changes, but they've been a while back, and there's very little change over time in the period that I studied. So the differences between countries in these systems hopefully are filtered out by my study design, but I didn't explicitly look at those. So then your question is household inequality affecting gender inequality. Yes, of course, probably that is very likely. There have been estimates about the skill-biased technological change, or the algorithms of the robots, and of course they show that women are the jobs that are most likely to be at risk of automation is somewhat, not that much, but somewhat overrepresented by women. So they're slightly more at risk. And if you think about, that universities used to have plenty of secretaries, for instance, and nowadays we have to answer our own email. I think that's a very good indication of how that has changed. In addition, it's a little bit of an anecdote, but there's been a debate a couple of years ago in the United States where the first cohort of women entering Princeton, which was only in 1976, if I remember correctly, they had a reunion meeting and they were talking to young female students. And coming home, one of those women said, okay, I was really disappointed by the debate because they were talking about leaning in or giving it all, having it all, really walking about their careers. And she wrote an op-ed in the newspaper saying, well, the advice I would have given to the daughter I never had is find a husband before you graduate. Very telling story. What I read in there is find a rich husband, of course, but what I also read in there is that in a very unequal society, people anticipate on what kinds of partners they might need to have an economically comfortable, by whichever standard, life. So people may respond to career prospects or economic conditions in a country in their partner's selection. So in that sense, this is, I think, a good example. I haven't tested it, but more generalizable, that relationship formation may actually be different in very unequal societies. And if that's the case, then you're absolutely right that the causal mechanism runs the other way as well. And I'm just buying time to think about your question. I've heard but because I've heard a prominent sociologist who I will not name describe these take it, use it or lose it kinds of rationing of parental leave to fathers, which has been fairly effective in Sweden and Norway, and at least getting fathers to take a little bit of leave. And she said, well, this just shows that men are like fruit flies; they respond to stimuli, to incentives. But it is true that this targeting has that this is a really good example, a fairly effective example of targeting. But of course, I'm pretty sure that this is mostly the high educated in well-paying professional occupations, fathers who do that. If in my university, if I would not take leave, my colleagues would certainly criticize me for that. So if there is an alternative to financial incentives, it must be changes of norms regarding what it is to be an appropriate father. So I started talking about doing gender, so we need to redo gender. But it was Gretny Edal from Iceland and Tina Rosgaard who wrote a book on fatherhood in the Nordic countries. It's they edited the book. It's a really interesting book. And in their conclusion chapter, they cite someone who said, everything that is constructed can be reconstructed. So also doing gender can be changed. Is that as simple as doing a policy incentives? I don't know, honestly. I know in Sweden there's a new line of research. There have been, when the Family Policy Act was changing in the 50s and 60s, there have been government initiatives of sending social workers to male breadwinner households to sit at the kitchen table and to talk about, to preach about almost the advantages of dual ownership and independent careers. Perhaps we should do that again. But I think the norms and the perception of that has changed. So basically my answer is, I don't know. I think incentives are a good step. Changing norms, talking about these things openly, role models, male role models in this case, are a step in the right direction, but it will probably take very long.